G'day people, Lord Stompy from Australia here. What we're about to witness is a 2008 video presentation by Tom Barnett, Chief Geopolitical Advisor to the war criminal Donald Rumsfeld and his neocon cabal. Barnett has also served as the chief analyst at Israeli intelligence company Wikistrat. So, how much power and influence does Barnett wield in the Pentagon's halls of leadership? According to Wikipedia, Barnett was asked by the United States Air Force to give a full presentation to every new officer who attained the ranks of general. He also received notoriety in March 2008 for publishing an article in Esquire magazine on Admiral William Fallon, which portrayed the admiral at odds with the Bush administration. This then led to Fallon's resignation as the head of Central Command. So we can see Barnett is a man who is writing the strategic blueprints for the top brass in the US, and he has the power to influence the advancement or firing of leading figures at the very top of the US military chain. Tom Barnett looms huge in US geopolitics, and he is clearly not a man to be trifled with. The video that we're about to view is excellent because Tom Barnett is unusually honest and transparent about the strategies and goals of the usually obscure and murky globalist Zio-con deep state. This is one of the very few moments the mask will be lifted on their global philosophy and their key goals and agendas. The brutally confronting presentation has the same shock and awe effect on the viewer that the Zio-con's global destabilization programs have had on our communities all over the world. And there is perhaps a deeper reason for this rare moment of transparent candor. Our elites tend to follow what can be defined as a legalistic contractual religion. The rules of the contractual legal system that these agencies are currently operating under require that they transparently expose their contractual offers to the human race for our legal consideration. If the human race accepts the new laws that our leaders are offering by complying with them, then under contractual law that is viewed as acquiescence and acceptance of the elite's new legal contract. Tom Barnett has written a number of books. One of his most popular, The Pentagon's New Map, War and Peace in the 21st Century, focused on the US role as brutal enforcers of their globalist democracy. In his book he states, the ultimate goal, therefore, has to be to make globalization truly global. This should be achieved by mingling the races to create a light brown race in Europe. To this end, Europe must accept 1.5 million immigrants from the Third World. The result will be a population of people with average IQ of 90 who will be too stupid to understand and intelligent enough to work. This statement confirms that the popular far-right conspiracy theory, known as the Kalergi Plan for White Genocide, really is being enforced as a globalist policy upon the peoples of European heritage. It is at the very heart of Zio-con globalist strategy for the 21st century. And Tom Barnett, with his characteristically blunt chutzpah, has revealed the Kalergi Plan is integral to the strategy of the Pentagon's new map. This idea to eugenically breed European races into a monorace of light brown worker slaves was first publicly published in 1925 by Count Richard von Coudenhove-Kalergi in his book Praktischer Idealismus. Kalergi was the founder and head of the League of Nations, and after World War II, he founded the European Parliamentary Union, which ended up becoming the modern-day EU. According to Kalergi's autobiography, at the beginning of 1924, his friend Baron Louis de Rothschild introduced him to international banker Max Warburg, who offered to finance his movement for the next 3 years by giving him 60,000 gold marks. Adolf Hitler was well aware of the eugenic plan to turn Europeans into a mono-race of mongrel slave workers in their homelands that Kalergi and his elite banker buddies were working on implementing. It was recorded that on several occasions Hitler mentioned Kalergi contemptuously as that cosmopolitan bastard. At the start of World War II, Kalergi had to flee Austria to USA to escape Hitler's wrath. Kalergi's plan to permanently obliterate the European race and culture was another log on the fire that flared up Hitler's extreme hatred for race mixing and international Jewish bankers. Since the founding of the EU, we have seen increasing waves of Middle Eastern and African refugees and immigrants flooding into Europe. The collateral damage on many European nations, culturally, socially and economically, has been immense. Countries such as Sweden, the UK and Germany have been especially hard hit by the sociopathic, genocidal Kalergi plan. Tom Barnett and his cabal have been using a cunning twofold strategy to achieve a large part of their global aims. Zones in the Middle East and Africa that defy the Zio-con global takeover are bombed into oblivion, and Western ground troops are then deployed to wreak further havoc. The terrified and scarred Middle Eastern and African civilian populations are then funneled into European countries, including Australia, New Zealand, USA and Canada, by the UN and other unelected, unaccountable globalist organisations. Our Western military personnel then come home injured and burned out or in body bags. This globalist method of operation kills many birds with one stone. The West gets inundated with refugees, thus furthering the Kalergi plan one step further. Dissident nations such as Libya are reduced to rubble and grinding poverty as punishment for defying the global overlords, and they are then held up as a global example of the crushing wrath of Zio-con power. And the poor Western taxpayer foots nearly all the costs for these exercises, economically, socially, and culturally. In this video, Tom Barnett himself points out that the burnout rate for our young Western military personnel is extreme. The streets of the West are filled with the human wreckage of our burned out, shell-shocked veterans. Instead of protecting their own people and their countries, our brave soldiers are being cynically exploited as globalist mercenaries, furthering the Zio-con globalist agendas. And when they are no longer useful, they are discarded on our streets like trash. In the West, returned veterans have some of the highest suicide rates in our society. In Tom Barnett's books and presentations, he has repeatedly stated that people, organisations, or countries that resist any of the Pentagon's Zio-con globalist goals need to be eliminated forever. In this video, Tom Barnett makes it totally clear what kind of force the Zio-cons intend to use on dissenters to the New World Order. When we view this video, we see that in Tom Barnett's world, escalation from persuasion to lethal force with almost no steps in between is all part of the globalist program of shock and awe. Shock and awe is sometimes also euphemistically referred to by the Pentagon as winning hearts and minds. As we're about to see, any countries, organisations or people defying Tom and his global mafia team are to be immediately crushed with lethal force as a warning to the world of the wrath of the American Leviathan. As Tom himself says in this video, I like to remain positive. My job is fear-mongering. There are some other important points of note in this video. Tom emphasises that all traditional societies running on rule sets that are different from that of globalised societies are slated to be torn apart overnight and turned into bland, uniform, gender-neutral consumerist societies as fast as possible. Tom Barnett points out that men, especially, will be angry about this and then tells them to get used to it. He mentions that the thing about globalism is you don't change globalism, it changes you. I must make a side note on this important point of targeted social vandalism against men. The other day I found a recent article in the British Journal of Psychiatry that noted the prevalence of mental health conditions and national suicide rates are increasing in many countries. Worldwide, over 800,000 people die by suicide every year, and suicide is the leading cause of death amongst persons aged 15 to 24 years. The article then suggests we dose our water supplies with lithium to make people happier so that they don't commit suicide. The fact that our current gender-neutral societies, full of zombified, rootless consumers, are now so dysfunctional that our younger generations are killing themselves off at record rates is not a problem for globalism. Hey, let's just dump some lithium into their water supply. This is just another marketable product. Soma for the masses to keep them happy. Tom Barnett's video outlines that the whole aim of the Zio-con game is to turn as many regions of the world as possible into zones with super porous borders and no real sovereignty, filled with fat, sluggish, mixed race, gender neutral, middle-aged consumers whose number one happiness in life revolves around acquiring endless products from multinational corporations. Tom eloquently sums up this happy new international class of rootless, cosmopolitan bourgeoisie and their role in the New World Order as 3 billion people want stuff. And if the grandiose narcissism of Tom Barnett bragging about the Zio-con's global strategy wasn't enough, towards the end of the video, Tom shows his personal moral and ethical code for all to see when he says, if I was born in Soviet Russia, I would have joined the KGB. This would mean I gain an education, wealth and power. The sociopathic chutzpah this man displays openly should be applauded, if only for its brazen honesty. No other political organisation in history has inflicted so much human genocidal misery upon their own population as the KGB, and Tom Barnett openly admits he wouldn't blink to join them if he was born a Soviet citizen. Tom is the kind of guy who would have joined the Gestapo in Hitler's Germany, the Communist Party in Maoist China, and he's also proud to admit this. And Tom certainly is right at home in the heart of the Pentagon, as part of the nation-wrecking team of Zio-cons. Here is a summary of Tom Barnett's key points outlined in his books and presentations to ensure the steady flow of immigrants in order to destroy nation-states and the cultures of historically established peoples of Europe and other nations. 2. To ensure the free flow of money to multinational corporations because, according to Barnett, sovereign nations must not have control over their own raw materials. All resources must be privatised and internationalised by corporations. 3. Unimpeded flow of funds to the United States. The governments of the world must not hinder the free movement of capital, that is, the outflow of profits to the United States. The world's states must indeed be forced to become more and more dependent on one another. The governments that will try to prevent this will be replaced by puppet New World Order governments who offer pretend democracy to their people. The enemies of this globalization will be destroyed, Tom Barnett claims, adding that the critics will be killed. 4. No country may oppose the peaceful deployment of the US military. Private armies will be deployed in some regional situations, including the notorious criminal agency known by the name Blackwater. 5. And finally, as much of the cost as possible from these globalist civilization-wrecking operations are to be offset onto the general public, usually the Western public. So, folks, let's fast forward from Tom's 2008 lecture to today and compare some notes. Here we all are in 2020, and we find ourselves in the midst of most of the dystopian scenarios Tom Barnett describes in the video we're about to view. We are living in his New World Order imposed gender-neutral societies with 72 confusing genders. Our rapidly plummeting male sperm count and testosterone counts are a testament to our rapidly marginalised and ostracised male populations who are becoming more feminised and gender neutral by the day. Europe herself is being more and more divided into tense balkanised zones of hostile foreign immigrants and white European traditionalist holdouts. Traditional cultures all around the world are being fragmented, torn apart, and swept away and replaced with a culture of superficial, rootless consumerism. Countries all over the world are being turned into dumping grounds for an unending stream of rootless consumer immigrants with no deep cultural roots. Suicide amongst our youngsters is at a record high. Global censorship is at an all-time high, with critics of globalism and its deranged narratives, both from the left and right, being especially targeted for the memory hole. Patriots and traditional citizens are being targeted for assault, destruction, and even death by angry, deranged communist mobs such as Antifa and Black Lives Matters. IQs around the world have been plummeting for decades. And the brazen global power grab by the globalist elites who are now using COVID as a cover to steal as much power and freedom from the masses as they can is in full swing. And the dumbed-down masses are too distracted and rootless to even appreciate what is really happening to them. Never mind organising themselves to fight the tyranny that is now oppressing them and taking all their hard-won rights and freedoms away from them. Indeed, we now find that we are in the final phase of the Pentagon's war on humanity. And to use their own terms, they have nearly achieved full spectrum dominance. Indeed, this is all as the Book of God predicts. This is a world of good and evil, and there are two very different masters in this world. One master is evil, and he operates by deceit, and he will smile, shake your hand, and then enslave, plunder, and destroy you and your children's future. The other master is good, and he brings safety, security, healing, peace, and a brightly satisfying future. And you can tell these two masters apart by the fruits of their deeds. Good people, look around at the world we live in now. What kind of harvest are our communities reaping from the fruit of our current globalist masters? Is it good or bad? How are things currently working out for us? And how does our future really look? As a final point on this matter of biblical inquiry, Tom Barnett himself keeps referring to the shock and awe arm of the Zio-con military machine as Leviathan. Leviathan is an evil, monstrous beast from the Bible that God eventually slays. Okay, folks, that's enough from me. Now I think it's time to listen to Tom Barnett explain the ins and outs of the New World Order game plan himself. Thank you.
Well, welcome. I think we'll get started. Good afternoon. I'm Allison Stanger, Director of the Rohatyn Center for International Affairs. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Thomas P.M. Barnett is a strategic planner who has worked in national security affairs since the end of the Cold War and has operated his own consulting practice since 1998. He is presently Senior Managing Director and co-founder of Ventura Solutions, an enterprise offering public and private sector organizations technology solutions to respond to issues of globalization, technological change, natural and man-made disasters, and other challenges. He also serves, as you can see up here, I think, as a distinguished strategist at the Oak Ridge Center for Advanced Studies at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and as visiting scholar at the Howard W. Baker Center at the University of Tennessee. He's a contributing editor to Esquire and is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Pentagon's New Map, War and Peace in the 21st Century, which has also been published in Japanese, Chinese, and Turkish, I think. Any others I should add to that list?
The Greek deal fell through.
Okay. And also A Blueprint for Action, A Future Worth Creating, published in 2006, and he's just on the verge of getting a new book ready for publication. I think we'll hear a bit about that today. Tom started his career in academe as a professor at the Naval War College, although we had a discussion earlier about whether that's really academe, but I submit to you that it is. But he very rapidly captured the attention of the world beyond the ivory tower. Like myself, he originally hails from the Midwest, and like myself, he is a proud holder of a master's degree in Soviet studies from Harvard University, making us both bona fide experts in something that no longer exists.
Outsourced to history.
That's right. We both also went on to earn PhDs in political science at the same institution, sharing at least one thesis advisor in the late, great Adam Ulam.
Yeah.
So I've known Tom for a long time and have watched his rise to prominence with a great degree of respect and admiration. His talk today is entitled The Pentagon's New Map and Other Stories. I think I would add to that. Please join me in welcoming Tom Barnett to Middlebury College.
Thank you so much. Well, it was a real thrill to hear from Allison, who I hadn't heard from in a few years. I can't remember the last time we interacted in the 90s, because I had done a bit on a piece she had done for the New York Times. I'd done a blog post on it. And that's a great way to reintroduce yourself to people, because she popped up on the web and made this invitation happen, and it's a lot of fun to see her again. So I'm really glad. And it's another indication, because I get a lot of business, if you can believe it, through my blog, that it's good to share things on the blog as much as possible. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the first book, which was really kind of a career-capping memoir for myself through 2003. Culminating in a 2-year experience working in Secretary Rumsfeld's office, Secretary of Defense, first 2 years after 9/11. This is a system-level view of the world. You'll recognize the Waltzian progression here. Second book, I drill down to the level of nation states and get prescriptive. So international system diagnosis, nation state prescriptive. I'll tell you, as somebody who's sold a lot of books, it's much easier to sell a diagnosis than it is a prescription, because people want to hear what's wrong, but they don't often want to hear how they have to change their behavior. I'm 155,000 words into this book, which I'm trying to finish before the end of the month. And that's what I'm calling it. I'm not sure what G.P. Putnam's going to call it, and G.P. Putnam gets to call it whatever they want. I'm going to give you a brief bit that I'm using in this book. It's a concept called development in a box. It's the notion that we got to get better at reconnecting societies, economies, post-conflict, post-disaster, even in a pre-canned bankruptcy sense. This is something that we got to get better at as a country. That's something we got to get better at in terms of a global community, because there are a number of failing, teetering states that need this kind of interaction, need this kind of intervention. We call it development in a box. It was a thought leadering process for us for a while, meaning I went around, waved my hands in front of people, told stories. It's now a $30 million bit of business for my company. So sometimes these ideas turn into money. I'm going to give you an argument on the new map. I'm going to tell you where I put this book in relation to other books in the 1990s. You think back to the Berlin Wall comes down, 89, everybody seemingly on the same rule set page. End of history, says Francis Fukuyama, in a great book that a lot of people buy, but not that many people actually read, because I think the title was too decisive. But in the book, he asks the essential post-Cold War question, which is, after ideology, what are we going to fight over? And if you get all the way to the end of this book, which is a brilliant book, last chapter, Wars of the Spirit, his argument is basically it's not going to be over economic systems. It's not really going to be over political systems. Everybody wants democracy. Everybody wants markets. It's not really going to be over land. It's going to be over questions of identity. And if you think about globalization as being sort of a reformatting process, you change more when you open up to globalization than globalization changes in response to you. Go figure. And the fact that globalization is now impinging upon some of the most traditional societies on the planet, meaning they've been most off-grid for the longest period of time. When globalization comes into these cultures, traditional cultures, which I'll define succinctly as male control over female in just about every aspect of life, globalization with its gender-neutral networks tends to empower women disproportionately to men. And I guarantee you in traditional societies, you're going to piss off young men when you come in and empower women disproportionately to men. They will give all sorts of names and all sorts of arguments to this anger, but basically you're taking a society and you're asking for rapid social change. Change that we didn't have in this country. I'd like to remind people we didn't give women the vote here for 144 years, and we'd like to give it to Afghanistan over the weekend, which is a big jump for traditional societies. So one of the first guys out of the box tried to answer that question, my favorite professor at Harvard. He was the only guy who ever graded my papers without putting the words "huh" in the margins all the time. And, until I got a paper back from Sam, I was like, I'm a complete idiot. They've let me into Harvard. I don't belong here. He actually answered some of my questions and wrote interesting questions, and I thought I have a future. Sam, as he gets older and whiter, I could say, takes a darker view of human history. He basically says people get together and they make war. They get organized into states, they make bigger wars. They get organized into blocks, they make even bigger wars. That gets you through the Cold War. So when he looked ahead to the post-Cold War era, he simply upped the unit of aggregation one further and described even more intractable conflicts. So as a view of human progress, it's rather dark. But he gave us a great point to debate, and he's arguably the best political scientist of the 20th century. I could say somewhat cattily, it's too bad he's still writing in the 21st century because I don't like some of his more recent books. His debate point was really answered best by Thomas Friedman, Lexus and the Olive Tree, a brilliant book, still his best book. You can draw a line between these two guys to find a spectrum because they really approach globalization from diametrically opposed angles. Friedman basically says some get it, some don't. Everybody will be forced to really, really fast. If you've ever taken a course on political theory, I say this is Marx on steroids. And if you've ever read The World is Flat, he came to that stunning conclusion with the help of his, as I call him, psychotherapist, Michael Sandel at Harvard. Sam, again, dark take. Globalization, some people are never going to get it. They lack the democracy gene, they lack the market gene, they lack some gene. Ain't going to happen. I give the third leg to this stool and in effect try to define a plane on this because I'm going to make a geographic argument. Okay? If you get the economic determinism from Friedman, you get social Darwinism from Sam, I'm going to give you the political military implications of that yin and yang-like struggle. Americans are very binary. We like decisions to be made. Globalization, does it stabilize or does it destabilize? Does it integrate or does it disintegrate? Are we winning or are we losing? Okay, and the answer is, depending on who you are and what's happening in your neck of the woods, all things are possible. It tends to destabilize before it stabilizes. It tends to disintegrate before it reformats and integrates. And I'm arguing you can plot that across history. So I say some got it, some don't. The spread is inevitable. It's been growing ever since we created the modern version, Second Industrial Revolution in the United States, post-Civil War. Okay, it arose in the shadow of the colonial model and then took over after the Second World War. And it's been enormously successful. I mean, just amazingly so. But it can get stuck. It got stuck on the Berlin Wall for 45 years. When the global economy expands, it tends to do so in spasms. Violence is attached to that process. So I can show you where violence is going to happen on that basis. Here's the map we drew originally for Esquire back in March 2003. 150 times we sent forces abroad, all those little dots. All I did as a simple political scientist, I drew a line around 95% of them and said, what is it about these parts of the world that attracts U.S. military power time and time again? Because they don't all have oil. although they tend to share the common characteristic of a developing economy, one or two commodities that dominate export earnings. And if you know anything about that, you know that's about the slowest way to grow your economy on average over time. So I'm arguing you're looking at the frontier of globalization here. Okay? And it's a moving line. That's our problem. Not that globalization's not moving fast enough. The speed is our problem. On the outside, I'll describe a functioning core, basically North America, Western Europe, industrialized Asia, what we've called the West throughout history. Up to 1980, 10% of the global population, 70% of the wealth and productive power. So the liberal trade order that FDR creates after the Second World War, not just sort of successful, stunningly successful. But now we've added 3 billion new capitalists in the East, key pillars in the South. That changes everything. You add 1 billion people in the next 12 years, global population, you're going to add almost 2 billion to a global middle class, which changes everything. I describe this outside, 2/3 of humanity, 90% of global GDP. I say they're increasingly synchronizing their internal rule set with an emerging global rule set, which I shorthand very succinctly: free markets, free trade, collective security, and transparency. I don't use the word democracy because most countries that embrace globalization do so as single-party states. And typically they do it for about 30 or 40 or 50 years. We see this time and time again. Mexico, South Korea, Japan, Malaysia is right on the tipping point right now. So to expect Russia and China and some of these other countries to rapidly embrace democracy at the same time they're undergoing all the social and economic change is simply illogical. I like to point out in America we didn't have a functioning two-party system until 52 years after the revolution. On the inside, I describe a non-integrating gap. No matter how you measure connectivity, it is thinner on the inside, thicker on the outside. Fiber optic cable laid, travel abroad for tertiary education, movement of goods and services, foreign direct investment, it is all thicker on the outside. You'll say the Middle East is connected to the global economy. I'll tell you, it's connected very thinly. Oil comes out, cash goes in. That's not connectivity, because that's not options. I say we got to shrink this gap. I say sometimes, a minority of the time, military force is going to be involved. I think the Balkans interventions in the 1990s were incredibly successful. Today, Slovenia, Croatia, Macedonia put in more troops, NATO peacekeepers, in Afghanistan than NATO puts into the Balkans, which means already they're exporters of security in the system. Ask yourself how long it's going to be before you see Iraqi peacekeepers somewhere outside of the Middle East participating in multinational exercises. Okay? Gives you a sense of how successful the Balkans exercise was compared to what we've done in Iraq. So we know how to do this, we just didn't repeat the process. Here's the mantra from the first book: disconnectedness defines danger. Show me a part of the world inside this shape. Since the end of the Cold War, I can locate, if we bump it back out for the Balkans there, basically every war, every civil war, all the ethnic cleansing, all the genocide, all the mass rape as a tool of terror, all the children lured or forced into combat activity, all the UN peacekeeping missions, all 8, I count Iraq as 3, good, bad, and ugly, U.S. nation-building missions, 95% of the terrorist activity in the last 20 years, virtually all of the mass violence in the system, all of it, inside that shape. It's not a neocon invention. It cannot possibly be voted out of office. This is the expeditionary theater for the U.S. military for the 21st century. Get used to it, I say. I emphasize this is a snapshot of a frontier integrating age. Those 3 billion capitalists want their stuff. This gap is going to be shrunk over the next 20 years, whether we're there to play bodyguard or not. If we are, and we do it well, much less violence will be attached to this process. Okay? It doesn't mean we can't screw up globalization. We did it before, quite nicely, with a bunch of smart leaders in the 1930s, and I'm sure we can do it all over again now. But I like to emphasize the positive, because my business is basically a business of fear-mongering. There's been more poverty reduction. There's been more poverty reduction in the last 25 years than in the previous 500. We've never had a bigger, stronger, more broad-based, more growing, facing a bigger positive impulse than we're facing right now. This global economy, we're going to add those billion consumers in the next 8 to 10 years. People with disposable income who want to buy stuff. We've never been on a more peaceful basis per capita. Never had a smaller percentage of humanity preparing for or engaging in levels of mass violence. Never. It's never been this peaceful. Global warming will make things difficult inside the gap. Big surprise. If you got money, you tend to do better with these problems. But it's not going to resurrect state-on-state war. All the big scenarios for the U.S. military, Taiwan's going away, thanks to Ma. Iran's going to get its bomb. Forget about that one. North Korea's about ready to drop. You take those three scenarios off, you don't have force structure rationales for a large force, the U.S. military anymore. So what the academics and what the fearmongers in my business are going to try to sell you are coming resource wars between rising powers, which I argue is complete nonsense, but people are going to peddle this like crazy. Why? They want to remain important in their field, I would argue, and they want to maintain the status of that force because that force comes with a lot of big-ticket money items that people want to see built. I argue there's a natural national grand strategy off this picture, three-pronged. First, you got to work across the core to deal with system perturbations, I call them. 9/11-like shocks to the system. It can be SARS, it can be subprime, it can be anything. You got to get better at dealing with this kind of turbulence. Second, you got to discreetly firewall off the core from the gaps worst exports. No surprise what those are, but you got to let immigration happen. Why? 80% of the population growth next 40 years is going to be inside my gap. Meanwhile, the core is going to age demographically, and I mean the entire core. China faster than anybody. Third, I say you got to export security to these situations. I'm not talking about selling them arms. I'm talking about the time and attention your forces spend to any region's potential or actual levels of mass violence. I say you need two different forces to do this, that we've been using two different forces for quite some time. We buy one and we run the other one to death. Okay? The first half force, the warfighter, the regime changer we got. That one, I dubbed the Leviathan, right out of Thomas Hobbes. An unparalleled capacity to wage war and the unspoken power that if a war occurs on this planet, anywhere on this planet, it occurs with America's okay because we have the only military force that can go anywhere and do anything about it. You want proof positive, you check out Darfur. The second half force, the nation builder, the disaster reliever, the counterinsurgency force, that force we did not have going into Iraq, we're building it now, the Army and the Marines especially, in response to the pain they're feeling in Iraq and Afghanistan. That force I dubbed the System Administrator Force, or sysadmin for short. What I'm reaching for there is a metaphor. This force, this function is going to be ultimately more civilian than uniform. It's going to be more U.S. government than just the Defense Department. It's going to be more rest of the world than just the United States. It's going to be more private sector funded, not public sector funded. Infrastructure development in emerging economies last 50 years was a supply push public sector from OECD, okay, rich countries. Now it is fundamentally a demand pull from the East, mostly private sector companies. That is a Hegelian flip of real big proportions. That changes everything. Differences between these two different forces. The Leviathan works with traditional partners. They're all going to look suspiciously like the Brits in their former colonies. The sysadmin's got to work with internationals, non-governmentals, private voluntaries, and contractors galore. So Eric Prince, CEO of Blackwater, despite his current legal woes, has a very, very bright future. The Leviathan's all about joint operations, making the services work together. Interagency is the buzz phrase here, much harder. The Leviathan, I call it your dad's military. I like them young, male, unmarried, and pissed off. The sysadmin, I call your mom's military. It's everything your dad's military loathes and fears it's going to be forced to become. It's going to be older. It's going to be more gender balanced. It's going to be more educated. They're going to be more married, and they're going to have more children. Here's your problem. This force comes and goes. This one rotates, which means the personnel issues get a whole lot more complex. You'll see an aging out from one to the other. How do I know? I've been to Eric Prince's 8,000 acres in Mayock, North Carolina. I got the grand tour from him himself. And I'll tell you, everybody who's training down in Blackwater is retired military. So we're outsourcing this function up to now. So one force takes down networks, doesn't hold press conferences. Special operations centric. The other force, no rendition, no secret prisons, no unexplained massacres, no graves you can't figure out, none of that. It's got to be completely open source, available online, translatable over the web, because it's got to work with everybody. And if it's scary enough that Microsoft doesn't want to come work with them, like Microsoft's working with us right now in Iraq, my company, then you're not going to get the answer you want on the far side because you want Microsoft to show up to Iraq. You want Microsoft to be comfortable enough to show up to Iraq. And that means this interface has got to be friendly for the Microsofts. I'll make an argument shifting to the second book about the scene between war and peace, which is hard to explain to Americans because we like to declare war on everything. We can't get an erection, we declare war on it. We got a bald spot, we declare war on it. If we got disposable income, we declare war on it. We declare war on everything in America, and we treat everything like war: football, sex, business, whatever, except actually war, which we, commercialize and put in video games. I like to distinguish between war, I call it the first half, and peace, I call that the second half. Okay? We tend to conflate the two. Everything is a war from start to finish, which is illogical. It's not the way it actually unfolds. This is going to be your average opponent in the 21st century. He's going to be about 15 or 16 years old. He's going to have maybe a couple of years of elementary school. He'll be on drugs way too much. He'll be recruited under the most unimaginable duress in a lot of instances. You want to see a good example, you watch Blood Diamond. Now, this kid doesn't want to take on our Leviathan force. For some reason, he considers this an unfair contest. I have no idea. So this guy will literally sit out the war, literally go underground. I mean, he will dig a hole in the dirt and go underground and wait till the bombing's over. He'll wait for those crazy Americans to declare mission accomplished. They pose for photos in Vanity Fair. They get their medals of freedom. They light up their victory cigars, go on their book tours. And then when they send in the B team, under-equipped, under-armored, outnumbered, under-trained, outgunned, then he goes on the offensive. His goal is not to defeat this force. He can't possibly dream of defeating this force. It's the most powerful military in human history. All he wants are 3 dead Americans every day. That's his goal. And he will throw unlimited labor at the problem. Hamas likes to say, the seeds of our victory lie in the wombs of our mothers, which is a poetic way of saying, I'll grow them faster than you can stomach killing them, which is accurate. So either you disrupt this game plan, or you're going to see it time and time again. This is what the Israelis got in southern Lebanon with Hezbollah, August 2006. They were suckered into a war that Hezbollah had no intention of winning, much less waging. Hezbollah was interested in getting to this part because they knew the IDF wouldn't stick around because they had gone through it before and it didn't work out so well. So we got to understand, big difference between war and peace. This is a stupid question that gets asked a lot. I answer it on CNN whenever I go on. Not Fox, but CNN. We won the war in Iraq with 137 combat casualties in about 6 weeks. It was just cause to take down Emmanuel Noriega in 1989. It was just cause on steroids. Instead of one guy, we wanted a deck of 52. Okay? We made no more planning for the post-war than we did in Panama, but it was a lot more noticeable in a country the size of Iraq. Okay? What we've been losing ever since Bush declared mission accomplished May 1st, 2003 is the peace. If you call it the war, the U.S. military will come up with war answers. War answers in the U.S. military mean more firepower. That doesn't work unless you believe in the Israeli approach to counterinsurgency, which I like to shorthand as it takes a tank to raise an entire village. This guy, controversially, was right about the footprint for the war. We took 240,000 troops, half of what we took to eject the Iraq army out of Kuwait, and we were enormously successful in taking that country down. Okay? This is where it got really stupid, though. They planned on going down to 30,000 troops by the end of the summer. We should have had 350,000, which is what this guy, then Army Chief of Staff Eric Shinseki, was arguing for. He was absolutely right, because we knew from Bosnia, we knew from Kosovo, if you have 22, 24 pairs of boots on the ground per 1,000 local population, your casualties as peacekeepers are 0. Okay? What we had in Iraq and Afghanistan is more like 4 to 5. Okay? And then we wondered why it didn't work. So I say I got a Department of War and I got my Department of Peace. Stop sending me those emails. My Department of War is my bad cop. He is stuck working the gap. He dreams of getting it on with the core, specifically China, Taiwan Straits, always 20 years in the future. I call it a tantric grand strategy. Never quite achieving climax, but always, justifying every program of record, every weapon system you can dream up between now and then. Because those clever Chinese have the advantage of proximity. Go figure. Over here, I got my good cop who doesn't know his ass from his elbow inside the gap. Poor Condi Rice scared all those FSOs when she told him, you will not put 27 years in Paris and call it an ambassadorship. To which they replied, Zimbabwe? They know how to work the core because they understand what it's like to work with functioning governments. A lot of the governments inside the gap aren't up to that standard. The State Department has a hard time figuring them out. Nobody works the middle very effectively. I go to plenty of exercises on the left with the military. I go to plenty of seminars with the bow tie crowd on the right. What I do not go to are serious explorations, enough of them, how you get countries from instability to stability, how you get them from disconnectedness to connectedness, how you get them from war to peace, how do you get them from what I call the gap to the core. And yet there's an emerging consensus in the international relations field that transition is everything in the 21st century. Master the transition, and you've got a model for change. Otherwise, you're just going to go back every 6 to 7 years and kill the same people each and every time. Basically, the Powell Doctrine from the 1990s, which we all loved because he's such a wonderful guy. And what did it get us? It got us Iraq, and then we went back. It got us Haiti, and then we went back. It got us Somalia, and if you were paying attention, we went back. So either you master the middle or strive by regime change from here on out. The public in America won't pay for it, neither will our Asian allies. Eventually, we're going to have to create a bureaucratic center of gravity for this process. I dub mine the Department of Everything Else. I call it that because I'm not quite sure everything that needs to go into it. But as my friend Dave Petraeus says, current commander in Iraq, there are no military solutions to these political problems. Petraeus' real problem is he works for the Department of Everything Else, and it does not exist. Because when he comes back to the Pentagon, they say, sorry, I'm planning my brilliant war in space against the Chinese next week. And when he goes to these guys, they say, I have no idea what you're talking about, but we'll definitely have a symposium on it. I wrote a piece for Esquire, July 2007, called The Americans Have Landed. It was on Combined Joint Task Force Horn of Africa, CJTF-HOA, and its use as a franchising model for AFRICOM. Okay? What they're pioneering on the east coast of Africa is what they call the 3D approach. It actually comes out of a USAID Nairobi mission in Kenya. Their argument is you've got to blend defense, diplomacy, and development up front. This is an argument for basically doing the green zone right from the start. Okay? Why does it matter? One of the first order of business is you're going to have to break USAID off from the State Department, which is never going to aspire to this role, and I don't want it to aspire to this role. Okay? You need to create something you can attract new allies to. Why? Jobs are your only exit strategy. We basically created the Great Depression plus in Iraq in terms of unemployment. And there's no way you can leave a place like that unless you're going to have a lot of violence in your wake. So there's a fundamental shift here that's profound between this Department of War that I got and this Department of Everything Else that I don't got. In the Cold War, if we used the Leviathan force, huge footprint, okay? It was an industrial era force. If we needed to do the sysadmin follow-on, it was easy because there was lots of overlap in terms of boots on the ground. The paradigm here, Normandy, June 1944. Huge invasion force, right on its heels, totally pre-programmed, an even bigger occupational force. And I mean they had everything planned down to the nth degree. Basically what the Bush administration said they were going to do in Iraq, and then we discovered it was just talk. Post-Cold War situation is a problem of success, not failure. We have so transformed the Leviathan. It is so lethal, so deadly, so agile, so decisive. It can come and go in a small footprint, beating the hell out of whoever we tell it to beat it. Long before we mount the follow-on sysadmin effort, you read a great book, Thomas Ricks, Washington Post, Fiasco. He describes the lost year, basically May 2003 till April 2004 when the 4 Blackwater guys got it in Fallujah. We wasted 10 months. And we wondered why the Iraqis turned on us when, quite frankly, they turned on us in New Orleans in about 6 days. So here's the dynamic we got to get used to. Wars have gotten incredibly shorter. 50 years ago, the average war was 8 to 10 years. Now it's about 45 days. 30 is much of them. The peace, though, has gotten incredibly longer. Your average post-war reconstruction is 8 to 10 years. Your average successful recovery from a disaster is 8 to 10 years. Your average successful counterinsurgency throughout history is 8 to 10 years. There's a saying in American prisons, do not do the crime if you cannot do the time. 30 days gets you 10 years. So choose wisely, I say. This has gotten incredibly easy for us. There's nobody we can't crush in a conventional manner. And don't spin me any tales about the Chinese, because the Russians exercise with the Chinese, and the Russians say, ha. That tells you something. This has gotten incredibly harder, because there's a blurring of peace and war, economics and development, business, private, public. It is incredibly dense. This has gotten incredibly cheap. We did this for 130 billion, half a trillion and counting. I can do this with a small footprint. I cannot escape the body requirements here. The better I make this force, the more I drive up the requirements for this force. Okay? We keep buying this force because we love it, because it's built in every congressional district in America. This is mostly about bodies and paying for time. And that doesn't get built in everybody's congressional district. In terms of who sizes our force, the Soviets sized this force in the Cold War. I asked the question, who should be sizing this force right now? I'll tell you the best Phase 4 post-war competition out there is Hezbollah, and it's Hamas. I'll tell you the best Phase 0 competition, often with the PLA in the lead, is 1.5 million, we estimate, Chinese nationals in Africa engaging in preemptive nation building, I call it. And they do a kind of slippery slide job of it. I'm going to make an argument about development in a box. I like to say George Lucas makes a lot of money on movies, but he makes a hell of a lot more money on merchandising. I will give you a cell phone so I can put you on a subscription plan. I will give you a razor so I can sell you blades for the rest of your life. This is not a new concept. GM doesn't make any money selling you a car. GM makes money selling you money to buy their car. Okay? There's the market, and there's the aftermarket. If you're stuck just building the thing, your profit margins are really tight. If you're in the subscription service for follow-on, that's where the money's increasingly made in this global economy. So you got to think about war as a market. You got to think about peace as the aftermarket. Because our real competition with the Chinese is who makes the most markets inside my gap the next 30 years. It's not over Taiwan. And that's a good competition to be in, frankly. So development in a box, we describe it as the ultimate push package for whatever. And I guarantee you, every time Raul lifts another one of those rules, boy, they are getting closer to launching this package out of Miami. Ooh. He's letting them use cell phones and DVDs now. The end is near. It's what we should have had for Katrina. It's what we should have had for Baghdad. And frankly, after Katrina unfolded, the Iraqis looked over and they said, oh, now I get it. You people suck at this at home, too. Slightly better job in Afghanistan. Slightly better job in Kashmir. We had 75% approval ratings among Muslims there after the so-called Chinook diplomacy. It's decreased since, but you can really have positive impact. Best job we've done recently, Aceh, Christmas tsunamis a few years back. Former rebel leader, now duly elected governor of the province. His new mentor is Lee Kuan Yew. They hired the Boston Consulting Group to rewrite their foreign direct investment laws. Money flows in. Okay? That's a success story, which is why you haven't heard anything about it anywhere, because it's boring. What we're searching for a lot of these situations, emerging markets, is a definition, sort of like an ISO 9000 series, that says these are the standards. Hit these numbers, you'll get money. Okay? That's what everything's about now in globalization, standards. Globalization is the spread of rules. You want to get into globalization and succeed, you have to meet standards. So I make an analogy in terms of development in a box. It's like building a house in a subdivision. You could say, I'm the United States. This is my subdivision called the global economy, the international liberal trade order I built 60 years ago and I've been nurturing ever since. You want to build a house in my subdivision. Okay, I'm going to tell you certain rules you're going to follow. You're going to make your doors this big. You're going to make your windows like that. Your steps are going to be this tall. Your wiring is going to be according to this code. Why? We don't want buildings that fall down, spread disease, burn, do all sorts of stupid things because people don't meet standards. Okay? I'm going to tell you all the pipes that are going to go into that house. The cable, the telecoms, the banking, the sewer, everything. Okay? Those standards are non-negotiable because these are standards we as a global community have created because we know they work. So if you want the internet, it's called TCP/IP. We're not going to change it for you. If you want a global bank that deals with other global banks, there are 1,400 core common banking principles, practices that everybody does. You're going to make those 1,400 happen, or you're not going to have a bank that plays with anybody because we won't trust you. And if we don't trust you, we will not connect to you. What I shouldn't be in the business, as my sub-developer would say when I built a house in Indiana, I'm not in the business of telling you what furniture to buy, what color your drapes should be. I'm not going to tell you what God to worship or what kind of food to cook or how to get along with your spouse. I'm going to let you figure out those cultural adaptations over time because I'm going to expect you to pick up on the cues that you're going to get from the rest of the neighborhood. This is how you succeed. But I'm not going to mandate those things. Just the interface, the connectivity that wraps around whatever your culture is. And then I'm going to expect you to change over time at a pace you can afford. First order of business when we go into a node, establish trust. Security is 100% of your problem until you get it, then it's about 10% of your solution. Because you want to connect that node to a larger outside world. You want them to plug so they can play. We say standardize this. It's being done across the board. Okay? Private sector driven. Provide it up front. Make that your aid package. Not resurrect their industries. Let them figure out their industries. Make the connectivity your aid package. Provide it up front. Attract private sector backbone providers. Leave the place more connected than you found it. If you think you're going to build economies with a bunch of aid workers and a bunch of military officers, two communities, quite frankly, who don't know their asses from their elbows, with anything having to do with entrepreneurship, okay, that's just nuts. You got to get business people in there if you want to create development. You got to get people in there who want to meet demands, not supply stuff. Supply stuff kills initiative. It kills local capacity. Iraq fed itself before we got there. We've been handing out rations ever since. Okay? They don't have an agricultural industry now. That's what you get with a lot of aid. What kind of standards should we use? We say look at the market, see what they like. A lot of money flows to Singapore, China. They have crossed some imaginary line that makes them super attractive in terms of foreign direct investment. I'll walk the dog backwards for you. There's got to be some level of infrastructure. Should it be completely built out? Hell no, I want to come and build it for you. We're going to put $10 trillion of infrastructure in emerging markets next 20 years. $6 trillion in energy, $4 trillion in water. Behind that, there's got to be a certain social level of well-being, so the peasants cannot be revolting. Okay? That's what gets you the return of the Congress in India. It's what gets you the return Lula's party in Brazil. It's what gets you the harmonious society push from the fourth generation leaders in China. Okay? You can never let the caboose fall too far behind the engine. You got to have a certain legal structure. Does it have to be perfect before I show up as an international businessman? Hell no, I'll help you write the laws if you let me. There has to be a certain state behind that. There's got to be a certain structure of security behind that. This is just Maslow's hierarchy of needs tipped on its side. Okay? The problem in Iraq and Afghanistan, we say if we build a security force, we put enough names on enough government doors, we've built ourselves a nation. You haven't. Unless you get to the point where people want to do business from the outside with this place, you've done nothing. Just schedule the next visit. So it's all about bringing them up to standards. It's all about taking a country that's less developed, this was the key buzz when you and I were going to school, LDCs, turning them into something useful, which is a low-cost country. I like to say it's just one letter change. How do you go from LDC to LCC? It can be as simple as Andy Grove, the CEO of Intel, deciding to put a $1 billion microchip factory in Ho Chi Minh City. When he does that, Vietnam becomes overnight a low-cost country. Why? Andy Grove says it's safe enough to put $1 billion into Vietnam. Okay? And Vietnam attracts more foreign direct investment in a couple of years than India has in the previous decade. Stunning. It's a reverse domino effect. Vietnam's going super capitalist because they're afraid they're going to get left behind the Chinese. Isn't that interesting how it works out now? So what did Vietnam do? They filled in enough of these blanks. Okay, they got out of the business of taking aid. They got into the business of taking foreign direct investment. The more aid you take in, which is basically hospice care, the more aid you take in, Bill Easterly points out, World Bank former economist, the more likely it is your economy is going to shrink. The shrinking economies all have large sums of aid coming in. Why does that happen? It's basically like the oil curse. The more aid you take in from the outside world, the less you have to care about what your public thinks, because you have independent source of funding. And every once in a while, if your military wants to cash out, sort of take some profit margin, they stage a coup. They grab their money, then they wait for it to pile up again, and they come back and do it all over in another 6 years. The Bush administration, the one brilliant thing they did in foreign policy, creating the Millennium Challenge Corporation, basically a government-sponsored hedge fund to encourage threshold economies up to a level where they'll attract foreign direct investment. Okay, and they lure them up to this level. They say, if you get here, we'll give you a lot of money. Fukuyama makes the argument, even if you don't give them any money once they get there, it doesn't matter. Because getting them to that point, other people will give them money, a lot more money. We say if you're a post-whatever state, we've expended blood and treasure on your situation. You go to the head of the line, you get a fast pass. You're the mouse that roars, which is a wonderful Peter Sellers movie from about 45 years ago. In this movie, a small principality in Europe, without a military, declares war on the United States. Why? They wanted us to come, kick their ass, and start the Marshall Plan the next day. And that tells you a little bit about our brand back in the 50s and 60s. The notion was if the Americans show up, very good things are going to happen for your economy. And the answer is we've been denigrating that brand ever since Vietnam. The reality is now you want to be next to the mouse that roars. Everybody around Iraq is booming because of the connectivity. Turkey is making money hand over fist. So is Iran. So is Jordan. They all are. So the minimum standard, as we define it, we say keep it simple. It's a 4-part process. You do best practices across industries. They do not do this in the USAID community, official developmental aid community. Why? It's plagued by regional experts. I'm a recovering regional expert. I spent the 80s learning a million reasons why Russia could never change. Because I had looked inside their soul. I had read their poetry. I knew how distinct and idiosyncratic they were. And it was full of nonsense, quite frankly, because the place flipped really fast. We say give them the software, give them the hardware. Give it all to them. Anybody who wants to connect to America in terms of ports, airports, anything, you give them the connectivity. On that basis, you extend your intelligence networks. Okay? And your price is, you get a fast pass if I can see what's going on inside your system. If your movement of goods and services are transparent to me from the outside, you get a fast pass. You get access to the most dynamic, richest economy in the world. And that's a real lure, as opposed to shoving democracy down their throat. We say put the rules embedded into the software. That's what my company does. If you're going to have a central bank, it's going to be the same the world over. If you do it in a country with Sharia, you're not going to charge interest on money. But there are ways to work around it. The Muslims have been lending each other money for about 3,000 years. It can be done. And then you prepackage all the training. You make them apprentices right up front. You turnkey it. You leave them with all the operations. You're interested in the subscription services that follow on. This is what we're doing right now in Kurdistan. We got a couple million from the Pentagon. That turned into a whole lot more from the Kurdish regional government. Okay, all we needed from the Pentagon was credentializing. Okay, we set up a B2B exchange. Because if you want to buy something in Kurdistan today, you've got to go there with a big sack of money and wander around asking if anybody's got anything to sell. Okay? There is no price discovery. There is no transparency. If you want to figure out what's for sale right now in Kurdistan, there is no eBay, except we just created one in 90 days. Then we created a call center using a local Erbil telecom. We connected that to Agility, Kuwaiti logistical firm. We connected that to a Lebanese bank. We got distribution centers, brings it to America, investment centers. We're outperforming in about 3 people that we got on the ground right now, the entire USAID State Department effort up to now in Iraq, which is stunningly bad. I mean, it's really bad. But what's so amazing, as soon as we start this process, guess who shows up? All these major global corporations want to interact with us because they want access to this place, because the Kurds have oil money. And they want to diversify their economy. But they didn't want to work with USAID. They didn't want to work with state. They don't want to work with the U.S. military. They want to work with somebody who understands that their business is about meeting demand. You want to create a strong federal government in Iraq. Okay? You get a federal government in response to local government. You get a local government in response to economic transaction rates locally. People want protection. They want contracts enforced. They want property rights enforced. You can't have that until you get a certain level of security, which the Kurds have had throughout. Okay? This is how this country was built, from the bottom up. We have a lot of myths. Okay? And this is how every country gets built. Last point on this, we say keep it simple. Everybody likes to do it Six Sigma. We like to engineer everything to death. The answer is keep it simple. Make the pipes Six Sigma, nice and big. Okay? Make it for future growth. But make the actual technology you employ in these situations 2 or 1 Sigma. Good example, Combined Joint Task Force Horn of Africa started putting these wells in East Africa, and they thought it'd be cool if they put a solar panel on top. Local kids come by, they see a shiny thing, they throw rocks at it till it falls down, they take pieces back to mom, and they say, I don't know, I found it. So Combined Joint Task Force Horn of Africa said, maybe we won't go with solar panels. Maybe we'll just put an iron foot pump on the bottom. Everybody gets it, it works, it doesn't break. Okay? So keep it real simple. People say you bring Africa online, which is happening with Chinese and Indian investment into all sorts of network trade and globalization right now. You bring Africa online, you're going to bankrupt the planet, according to Edmund Wilson. You're going to need 5 Earths to bring Africa online. The answer is Africa is going to be a knockoff of India, which is a knockoff of China, which is a knockoff of South Korea, which is a knockoff of Singapore, which is a knockoff of Japan, which 60 years ago did a knockoff of the United States. Okay? You're not going to bring them up to American standards. You're going to make them look more like these guys. frontier integrators of the age. Make a quick argument on Iran and Iraq, which is, I know it's hard to keep them separate. Iran right now can basically veto our efforts throughout the region. They proved that 2 days ago. Okay? No surprise. We take down the biggest Sunni dictator. We create a Shia revival throughout the region. This is the Shia center of power. If you weren't figuring that was going to happen, then you're just too damn dumb to run the government, I say. Iran thinks if they get a bomb, they'll protect themselves from U.S. invasion. They have 63 years of world history that says they are absolutely correct. Okay? I walk up to a park bench. 3 people are sitting on a park bench. I shoot the guy on the right through the forehead. I double tap the guy on the left. Meanwhile, the guy in the middle reaches for a gun. My question for you is he irrational? Or did I just make that decision for him? Okay? That's how Iran looks at it. Taliban, Saddam, right on either side of the country. And then we wonder why they reach for a bomb in the meantime. Because they're not stupid. Now, what they've done doesn't signal their irrationality either. I would argue these guys invented chess. They know how to wage asymmetrical war. They did a brilliant job in Lebanon. And if you think they're stupid about how they're approaching the nuclear question, I would say they're doing it very cleverly. They basically showed the world, we got the guns, okay? We're building the gunpowder. You're tracking that. For now, we're going to refuse to build the bullets, which is basically Japan's position. I could get a nuke if I wanted one, and you're not quite sure how long it would take me, but for now, I don't think I need the bullets. Iran looks an awful lot, and we get this from a lot of Russian experts in Russia, I mean actual Russians. It reminds them a lot of late Brezhnevian Soviet Union. The mullahs pretend to rule, the population, overwhelmingly young, pretends to obey. Okay, they have student unrest in Iran right now that parallels a lot of what went on in the late 1970s. This is not a place I take down with a hard kill. I do the soft kill. I ask them what they want, and I provide it to them as much as possible in terms of connectivity. I get off this manic focus on weapons of mass destruction. I take them down with MTV instead. Long term, as we think this thing through, the Middle East is all going to turn in our favor for a lot of reasons way beyond our control that has nothing to do with us. So our job is not to fix the Middle East in the short term. It's not to screw it up. 4 key reasons. First, the Middle East is going to middle age in the next 20 years. Not a possibility. It's going to happen. There's a youth bulge now between 10 and 29. I guarantee you, in 20 years, it's going to be between 30 and 50. Okay? Fertility rates dropping throughout the region except for Palestine. I'm not saying they're not going to have babies. They're going to have plenty of babies. I'm going to tell you the center of gravity demographically is going to shift from youth to middle age. Every time that's happened in human history, crime, revolution, everything goes down, and you better have jobs waiting for them. That's the challenge. 100 million jobs in MENA, Middle East, North Africa. Externally, there's going to be 3 blowbacks that are going to be all very profound. And I'd like to emphasize, most Muslims do not live in what we call the Middle East. It's much bigger than the Middle East. Islam left the Middle East a long time ago. That's why it's a successful global religion. You lose the culture. That's how you go global. First one, it's going to be a religious reformation led by uppity Muslim women and incorrigible youth here in America. I say to Islam, too damn bad. It's happened to every religion that's ever come here. My favorite example, young Muslims who say, I don't want to be defined by the past. They tell their parents, I don't care about the old country fights. I don't care about the differences between Shia and Sunni. They actually call themselves, and I love this, they call themselves sushi. I now understand why when I told my mom I was thinking about becoming Episcopalian for a while. And she's a Roman Catholic Irish, and she just grabbed her chest and hit the floor. I now understand why. There's going to be a political reformation led by the rise of Islamist parties in Europe. Okay? They're going to perform the same function that Marxist parties did there in the Cold War. They're basically going to connect disenfranchised, ghettoized urban populations. The people who do the 3D jobs, which Hispanics do in America, dirty, dangerous, and difficult. If you don't connect them, you got a revolutionary situation on hand. And the place to watch, counterintuitively to some people, is actually France, because they have really strong standards for secularization. So there's going to be some sort of package put together there that's going to have a real big impact. But most importantly, it's going to be the rise, and we see it already with the lead geese, Muslim economies in Asia that are showing you can be roughly Muslim, meet everybody's demands, roughly pluralistic, very market-oriented. These things go together quite nicely. Malaysia came to the Middle East 8 years ago and said, we want to float Islamic sovereign debt, they called it. The imams in the Middle East said, it'll never happen. It's now an $800 billion industry. Okay, so this can be done. The interesting thing about the oil boom this time, it's not coming over here in terms of petrodollars. They're spending it here, about half of it, another chunk here, and the rest goes over here. So the osmosis process here is going to be profound. One more point. I like to reveal my biases. It's crucial. It's a standard practice, Royal Dutch Shell methodology of futurism, as I call it. You've got to reveal your biases. Here's a family photo. That's me. That's my wife. That's my firstborn daughter, firstborn son, secondborn son, Rhode Islander. And I'm still not quite sure what she is. She hails from an interior province in China. We got her when she was 9 months old. I found it highly suspicious she couldn't speak a word of English. I thought she was going to be a sixth deduction until I learned what the alternative minimum tax was. Okay, China's hard for us to figure out because depending on where you go in China right now, you can find the last 125 years of America's developmental timeline. Okay, everything but going all the way back to where we were wild and scary, all the way through the 1990s, go-go entrepreneurialism. In terms of their foreign policy, it looks an awful lot about Teddy Roosevelt time. They're built on a bit of a stick. They barely raise their voice in public. Their space program, I raise my glass of Tang and salute. And the scary thing is, if the Chinese actually send a man to the moon, they'll only be 10 years behind us technologically at that point. Their internal investment looks like our 1920s, which scares us because our 20s were followed by our 30s. Their sports are going to win the most gold medals in Beijing this summer, I guarantee you. And I guarantee you the U.S. Senate will launch an immediate investigation into this national humiliation. Chinese got a sexual revolution going on, mostly online. They love to blog. I got toasted one time at a big dinner in Beijing, last time I was there. And my Chinese host said, Dr. Barnett, I propose to you American society based on sex, Chinese society based on food. And I said, really? How come we're so fat and you got 1 billion people? They got a movie industry that's fantastic. It's right out of our 1930s. They're post-industrial. They still break heads. They got women joining the labor force right out of World War II. All of this is going on at the same time. Best mass media presentation, what it's like to be a capitalist in China. I say check out HBO's Deadwood. That's basically it. You can try to find some communists when you go there. I look every time. I've never found one. Right on top of this, the biggest migration, rural to urban, in human history going on inside this country. On top of this, the biggest shift from plan to market we've ever seen in human history. On top of this, the biggest shift from closed to connected. 200 million internet users, allegedly all under mouse arrest. Good luck. A shift from young to old. China's going to age faster than any society in human history. Europe had 100 years to go from 10% of their population over 65 to 20%, the so-called Florida mark. America will have traveled 6 decades. We'll hit it about the time I retire and you, 2035. I guarantee you America will not be ready. I guarantee you Europe was not ready now. Neither was Japan. China's going to make the transition from 10% to 20%, we think, in about 20 years. They're going to have an elder population the size of the United States in 20 years. I guarantee you they're not going to be ready. They're going from a small to a very scary environmental footprint. The shift from fourth-generation leadership, which did not travel abroad for their tertiary education because they stayed home. It was the 1960s, Cultural Revolution. Fifth generation coming online in about 4 years. They went to school with us in the 1970s, late 1970s, early 1980s. This is a very sophisticated bunch. These are the guys that got my book published in China without any censorship. Okay? These guys were scared to death of publishing it. So I say the choice China, we have on China today is much like what the Brits had at the beginning of the 20th century. They could see their empire setting in terms of its global dominance. They hitched their star to the rising power in the West. On that basis, they punched above their weight the entire 20th century. Still do. Okay? They had to make a choice. They had to co-opt those crazy Americans who they never liked, never quite trusted, so they could take on the Germans. Okay? The Chinese read a lot of our history. They're very concerned about being interpreted like this. They want to be seen more like that. And I would argue economically, they're exactly like we were about 120 years ago. Very similar. They lacked a political system to deal with those problems. That's the scary part. So I think our choice is much like what the Brits had. We could see we're peaking economically in terms of global dominance, not because we're still not the most risk-tolerant, creative, innovative, dynamic economy in the world, because we are. Davos named us the most competitive economy on the planet for the third year in a row. That's not our problem. Our problem is 3 billion new capitalists with cheap labor and a lot of demands, which changes everything in a good way. So either we hitch ourselves to this rising star in the east, or we're not going to be able to punch above our weight. Something we're proving right now in two relatively small situations, Afghanistan and Iraq. Okay? The level of mil-mil that we got right now, military-to-military cooperation with the Chinese, is minuscule. We've had 2 naval exercises. Both times, they sent a ship, we sent a ship. We went around each other and talked on the radio. That's the extent of our military cooperation. Meanwhile, we're telling them, could you get rid of, Kim Jong-il? Could you make that happen? I like to say, just send the train back empty next time. We won't ask. Could you get rid of the junta in Myanmar? Could you make Darfur work? Could you do all these things for us? And this is the level of cooperation we got with them. And we put a report out every year saying they're our #1 high-tech enemy of the future. And we wonder why they don't want to help us. Okay? I call this wanting to go all the way on the first date. On this side, I got the unprincipled Leviathan who doesn't give a rat's ass about international law, monomaniacal focus on terrorists, runs around the planet, shooting it up, grabbing bad guys. Wonders why he scares everybody. On the other side, I got the totally unprincipled sysadmin who says, show me your stuff. Really? Show me your port. Really? Can I build a railroad from your stuff to the port? I'll give you whatever you want. I don't care about your human rights record. I don't care what you do to your people. I want your stuff. Okay? I put these two together, I have an almost semi-principled, full-service superpower. And I want to build that relationship right now in Africa, because that's what's coming online in the next 20 years. Think about the countries that helped us build this Leviathan force, Brits and their former colonies. Okay? This is the winning package from the Cold War. We need their help to figure out the sysadmin, because all these countries are better at counterinsurgency than we are. Americans are very binary. We like to leave smoke in holes. But these guys aren't having enough babies for this job. They're simply not going to have it. You need to contact, you need to elicit, you need to make alliances with the frontier integrating powers of the age, the people who are having lots of babies, rising military budgets. Because for these countries, it is not a war of discipline. Okay, if globalization torpedoes tomorrow because of violence in the Middle East, the West will still be rich. Okay? These guys might see their economies torpedo. For them, it's a much riskier affair. So the problem we got right now in this global war on terror, as we describe it, is we're trying to get all our friends from countries for whom this is essentially a war of discipline. And we're not making alliances with countries for whom this is essentially a war of survival. They need globalization to work. So when I look ahead for alliances, a strategic triad, as I call it, for the sysadmin function, it's obviously going to be the United States. If we don't show up, nobody else does. The other two powers are going to be China and India, 2 million-man armies. We're very interested in making globalization work and spread and be stable. And we're achieving this kind of connectivity in all the regions we're interested in bringing online. So I say locate labor where the problems are. All your WMD proliferations in the Indian Ocean Rim, these guys are all over Africa. Last slide. Think about globalization as a series of successful replications. The original version, 17th, 18th centuries after the Peace of Westphalia, happens in Europe. Huge infrastructure build-out. Time and space is conquered very radically. Okay? They try to replicate themselves elsewhere. They do a horrible job here, not so good over there either. Where they're successful is in North America. Why? We're the ultimate greenfield operation, and we're smart. We spin off and do our own startup company as early as possible in the process. Okay? These guys self-destruct in a massive civil war, 1914 to 1945. Our system becomes ascendant. What do? We successfully replicate ourselves in Asia. And yeah, wars attached to it. Japan, Korea, Vietnam. Okay? But that model is now successfully replicating all the way across to Pakistan, which is booming economically in a market reform movement. Despite the political problems, Pakistan's booming economically. So you ask yourself, who's going to make this happen inside my gap next 20 years? Do you think the Europeans are going to show up? I say no. Been there, done that, got the T-shirt. Are the Americans going to show up? Not in enough numbers. Way too expensive politically and every other measure. The people who are going to bring globalization to my gap are going to be the Asians. And this is happening in big numbers already. And they're the logical model. The last one in is the next one to spread. And the way they're going to conquer and integrate this gap economically is the same way it was done in the past. No mystery. I'll take your questions. Sir?
Could you say a little bit more about China's behavior in Africa vis-a-vis your stages of state, legality, and that sort of thing? Because it seems to me they're finessing a lot of that, no?
Well, the difference between the United States and China, when they go to a developing economy, the United States comes in and says, we want you to have democracy, to entrenched elites. And the subtle message there is, you could be voted out of office next week. And for some reason, the entrenched elites don't find that a very acceptable message. The Chinese come in, and what they preach, I know because we hired the guy who was the head of NATO South, who did all this work throughout Africa, Harry Elric, who was the head of the Naval Forces Europe and had control of virtually all of Africa, traveled around, did all this kind of work in abundance. What the Chinese do when they come in is they say, we want to teach your government how to be resilient and how to get connectivity to the global economy, and you get to stay in power. And that's a very attractive message. Now, I would argue over time, we got to be sensible about our sense of timing and sequence. If I get the Chinese to connect these places up in globalization's trade, I'm going to get an Africa that gets a lot of problems solved. And I can work on democracy over time. I want to funnel all that money coming from the East into Africa into proper governance. But I'm not going to make perfect governance be the high threshold for allowing this to come in. I'm not going to dissuade the Chinese from coming there, because I don't want to dissuade the Chinese or the Indians from coming there. Okay? Globalization right now, 2/3 of the trade is multinational corporate controlled, which is nefarious to some people, but who do you expect to move all the stuff around the planet except multinationals? You're not going to call up Africa and say, can I have 14 peanuts? Can you send it tomorrow? A big multinational is going to make that happen. Half the multinational trade, roughly 1/3 of global trade, is intra-corporate trade. Okay? They call it network trade. Two big types. There's buyer chains like Walmart. Okay? There's network production chains like Toyota. Okay? Right now, Africa is coming online in terms of buyer chains. And a lot of this investment is being done by the Indians and the Chinese. The big hope is, can you flip them over into production chains? Meaning you would go to Africa, build cars in Africa, and for other cheap markets. Okay? I want to encourage that process. Will I sacrifice a certain developmental timeline on democracy to do that? Absolutely. Because I'm much more realistic about what needs to be done than trying to make democracy work in a place where people are worried about food and all sorts of other things. So I'm very forgiving with the Chinese because, you know, the answer can't be Africa's America's and America's alone to ignore strategically, like we've done for the last 20 years. There's been a holocaust to death inside of Africa in the last 15 years. 7 million people, roughly, we estimate. 7 million occurred on our watch. And I guarantee you, your grandchildren are going to ask you 30 years from now, what did you do to prevent the Holocaust in Africa in the 1990s, turn of the century? And if your answer is, well, it was the go-go 90s, I was making a lot of money, it was busy, it was a confusing time, you know, we wanted to help out, but we just couldn't make it happen. That's probably not going to be a good enough answer for history. So I'm forgiving of what China is doing there because I'm realistic about where they go and what they can make happen. I want to funnel it, and I want to make my effort through AFRICOM, where, you know, quite frankly, the U.S. doesn't have a lot of economic interest in Africa, other than some oil. And quite frankly, we'll get the oil, whether Africa burns or not, because oil is a global market. It goes up to the market. Whoever wants to pay the most for it gets it. You don't need bilateral relationships for that to happen. That was gone 20, 30 years ago. Now, the Chinese go into Africa and display a mindset from 30 years ago. They say, I want to own the barrel in the ground to feel secure about it. And they're paying 2 to 3 times above market value in Sudan and other places. And I don't want them to do that, because I'm not interested in bringing inflation into China's production networks, because that just hurts my global economy, makes everybody poorer over time. China's lifting huge numbers of global population out of poverty. So I don't want them to come in and pay above market value, taking a very cynical view of what needs to be done in terms of transparency and change in these countries. I want to make a partnership there where I say, in effect, to the Chinese, you want to develop Africa, I want you to develop Africa. I have certain security and political concerns there. We ought to be able to work together on this problem. And I'll tell you, frankly, up to now, AFRICOM has not started that conversation, but they're on the verge of doing it. One of the things I make a life mission is convincing everybody, right up to Kip Ward, the first commander, that this is something that has to be done. Because you make that kind of connectivity happen, it really changes things. We take over the French Foreign Legion fort in Le Monnier in Djibouti 5 years ago. We signed a long-term lease recently, about a year ago. Dubai International Ports comes in right after we sign the lease, and they say, we want to triple capacity in Djibouti. Now, Djibouti's got nothing. Okay? It's a bunch of people living in a town. The president flies in drugs every day at noon, caught, and they all get high by 3 o'clock. That's their economy. I mean, it's pathetic. It's a mellow place after 3 o'clock, but it's pathetic. Okay? Now, nobody would come to Djibouti to make the port capacity triple unless they were interested in interior landlocked countries having access to Djibouti on that basis. Okay? AFRICOM is very interested in that because that creates stability. Okay? Our goal is to say to AFRICOM, we're doing a resilient port infrastructure in Philadelphia. We're revamping the port, my company, a lot of sensor work. Okay, and a lot of high-end stuff. We say, if we can make that model work in Philadelphia, let's tell Dubai International, we'll support your effort in Djibouti if you do this kind of sensor network. If you do, we'll connect Djibouti directly to American ports. Right now, Djibouti, if it connects to America, has to go to Rotterdam or Amsterdam, offload everything, repackage according to American standards, then they're in the network, then they can come to America. Adds huge costs. I'd like to connect Africa ports directly to the United States, but only if I can get the transparency involved. Because if I get the transparency, then I got another flashlight on a very media dark part of the world, and it makes it harder for Al-Qaeda and other people to operate. And Djibouti's interested in that. What was interesting was when Dubai International Ports came into Djibouti, they said to the president, we can budget for everything here except your greed. That's what he told them, flat out. I'll budget for everything except your greed. And what he said to him, in effect, the same thing we said to the Kurds when we went there. We said, you make this much money corruptly now. If you want to make this much money, I'll show you how. Okay? But transparency is the price. Okay? And it's a good trade. The more we do that with the Chinese, the better off they are. And frankly, the Chinese are forced to have transparency every time they screw up stuff. Tainted drugs, tainted products. Every time, the most revolutionary force, I argue, in China today is a pissed off American consumer with a lawyer. Because that will force change. That will force Upton Sinclair-like change in China. Why? Because if the Chinese don't change, guess who's going to steal that market from them? Somebody else is going to do it just a little cheaper and a little more secure. We see this all the time. We had hoof and mouth going to, in our beef, to South Korea. Next day, Argentina kicked us out of the market. We can't get back in. Okay, Australia kicked us out of the market. What does Australia do? They tag their cow at birth with an RFID emitter. They'll tell you everywhere that cow's ever been, everything it's ever eaten, everybody it's ever talked to. Okay? And that's the transparency that's required. You think about global warming shifting food production patterns. You think about a rising demand for meat and dairy in a lot of these emerging markets. The amount of global food trade is going to make the oil trade look like nothing. And food, it has to be incredibly transparent. You can't stick it in a tanker and just fly it around. Okay? You've got to have refrigeration. You've got to have protection against disease. The amount of transparency and control in that system, which is coming very rapidly, is going to be absolutely humongous. Because the Chinese have increased their dairy intake 6-fold in the last 10 years. And they're still only 1/3 of America. They've increased their meat consumption 50%. Because go figure, people get richer, they don't eat more food, they eat better food, more intensive food. So a lot of hyper-interdependency, as I call it, coming online very fast. And if we can get Africa online just a little bit before global warming starts to make the middle of Africa really food dependent like you wouldn't believe, we do a very good thing there. So I'm not going to argue over democracy in the short term there. I want to get Africa into the network trade as quickly as possible because there's going to be mass starvation there if it's not.
Historically, every time a new nation has developed or has come to the global stage, there has been some sort of major global conflict. Same happened with America or when Britain was rising. Or
I wouldn't say global conflict, no.
Or a big conflict.
A little violence usually attached to the process, yeah.
So do you see that happening when China is sort of coming onto the global stage, and if yes, how disruptive will that be to that network? Because it's quite tempting for 2 or 3 or whatever, however many countries to ally just to preserve their balance of power.
Yeah, the rise of Germany and Japan was successfully managed for quite some time prior to the First World War. It obviously came to failure in terms of 1914 for a lot of reasons. Norman Angell wrote that book, The Grand Illusion, saying if they went to war, they'd destroy themselves because they were so interconnected. All their empires would be destroyed in the process of going to war. He got a Nobel Peace Prize in 1933, sort of a consolation. He wrote the book in 1912. But Norman Angell was right. All those empires went down the toilet. None of them survived the process. The difference between now and then, and what we're talking about with India and China, is just their resumption of normal status in the global economy. Go back to 1800, India and China are 65, 70% of global GDP. And then they don't catch on to the Industrial Revolution, and so they drop off the map. Now they're just coming back to where they should be. Can we bring them online without global conflict? The short answer is, now we got nukes, okay? And nukes change everything. Nukes kill great power war. They rule it out. So you can do other things. You can balance internally. You can have proxy wars in third world locations, that kind of stuff. But there's no great power war in this process. I mean, I've sat in on a lot of scenarios for Taiwan. It gets so fantastic, so fast, it's just unbelievable. We're going to blockade Taiwan for 3 months in a conflict. Are you kidding? Like Sam Walmart's going to put up with that for like 48 hours? Like Michael Dell's going to put up with that for 48 hours. Taiwan, when they had an earthquake 8 years ago, they were producing 2/3 of the world's motherboards at that point. They decided not to rebuild the factories. They moved them all to Shanghai. They now control 70% of China's high electronics exports. So Taiwan's already conquered China. Am I going to have a war over that at this point? No. The level of interconnectedness economically is much more profound than what you saw going up to World War I, for example. That was uncompetitive movement of raw materials from colonies to homeworlds. Okay? And there was a fight over who could get more access to more resources. That was not a really integrated production supply chain like we got now. Nothing like it. You put nukes on top of that to rule out high-end war, I don't see any reason why we can't integrate them on this basis. For all sorts of reasons. I mean, for example, they hold $1.4 trillion in U.S. Currency right now, which means we've got a mutual assured destruction pact already going between us and the Chinese financially. There's no way they can get rid of that money fast without losing a ton of money and probably sending their economy down the drain. If they did, they could certainly send our economy down the drain. Is anybody interested in doing that? Well, outside of Washington, no. But we still have, we're still beset by boomer politicians, unfortunately. I would argue for another 5 years, or maybe another 8-9 months, who grew up in a different world where politics determined everything. I mean, they're Cold War babies, so they look at the world, and McCain's got it really bad. They look at the world and they say, if you look like me politically, then you can be my friend. And the reality we're in right now, you've taken a globalization that was 10% of the world's population 20 years ago, now it's 70%. Okay, we're trying to make a rule set that used to work in a very closed club, now work for a much bigger pool. Okay? And you could say, well, I can't really work unless you all become democracies instantly. And on that basis, you may just torpedo, arguably, the most fantastic gift anybody's given the planet, the liberal trade order that FDR engendered and secretly built and managed through Lend-Lease and that whole process and unleashed on the planet and made the West work and now is making the rest of the planet work. I mean, that's our gift to history. We're the model for globalization. Okay? And that was an amazing accomplishment in the last 100 years that we've, it started as a brainchild with Teddy Roosevelt, came in some form with FDR and Truman, really hits the global stage after the Cold War. Do I want to screw that all up because I demand you look like me politically now, otherwise I got to go to war with you? To me, that's the height of folly. We're in an age of frontier integration where your focus should be, do you look like me economically, not politically? That's the shift. And I think we get past the boomers, no problem. Because once you get to somebody like my age or Obama's age, he's born in 61, I'm born in 62, we didn't grow up in the 60s. We grew up in the 70s. And everything that happens in this world basically got its start in the 70s. Nixon and Brezhnev end the Cold War with SALT. Nixon opens up China, changes world history. OPEC, rise of oil, rise of the global economy, rise of the environmental movement. All that really comes of age in the 70s. You get leadership that grow up in the 70s, you're going to have a very different mindset. Obama's just the tip of that iceberg. But if we could sneak him in this year, life would be much better, I say. Sir?
I missed the reference to Russia in all of this. Or did I miss it?
No, you didn't, because they give me 45 minutes to talk and I can only do so many slides. As a former Soviet expert, I'll tell you, Russia's evolution since 1990 is absolutely no surprise. Think of Russia as a bell curve, okay, of talent. On the left tail, you had the Nalyeva economy, the black marketers, who basically kept that place running the last 15 years, okay? On the right tail, you had the Naprava guys, the security types, we call them Siloviki, the power guys. They kept the political system running the last 10 or 15 years. In the middle, you had the vast, undifferentiated, largely alcoholic population. Okay? Guess what? They didn't adjust too well to the possibilities coming out of Russia. What came out in the early 90s was the guys on the left took over. Okay? They stole a lot of stuff from the government, the so-called oligarchs. Khodorkovsky got his version of Microsoft for like $100. He didn't build it. They just gave it to him in a crony deal. And then he was cracked down and everybody cried because he said, oh my God, he's cracking down on the capitalists. That's not a capitalist. That's a guy who got something for a song and made himself one of the richest men on the planet on that basis. Okay? So think about the Nalyeva guys on the left. They were the talent pool. The Naprava guys on the right, these are the two talent pools. The black marketer guys and the security guys, KGB. And if I'd grown up in Russia, I would have been part of the KGB because I would have wanted a good education and an opportunity for advancement. Okay? So the left rules in the 90s, the right strikes back in the 2000s with Putin, okay? And it goes back to what Russia has been historically, which is they basically told the oligarchs, if you want to make money in this country, you do it the old-fashioned Russian way. You get yourself a good, high-level job in the government, which we find corrupt. But if I take you back to 1880s America, I could find you a system that's not that different from Russia right now.
Where are the entrepreneurs coming from?
That's a generational shift. I remember going back to Russia in 95, and I was told by a lot of people it would take them, generations to find people who could do this. I went back in 95 and I saw the place being run by all these 18-year-old males on the make. And I realized, what's an 18-year-old male in Russia in 1995? That kid was born in 1997. He didn't know who Stalin was. He didn't know who Khrushchev was. He didn't even know who Brezhnev was. I mean, as soon as he took his first breath and figured out what was going on, all of a sudden Gorbachev shows up and the whole thing's falling apart, and he's got no imprint from the past. Okay? So how long does it take to change a country like that? The more that young generation moves through the system, the better off we are. So I don't worry about Putin picking a third term with Medvedev. King Andrew I, Andrew Jackson, did the same thing with Martin Van Buren. We have some of this history in our past, too. It's not the worst possible outcome. I really think Putin will fade pretty dramatically in the next 10 years because the system's getting more and more regularized. And profits are going up, and people are developing middle-class attitudes and tastes, and it's been very stable. And they're actually becoming very vulgar and consumeristic, and pretty soon they're going to look just like Americans. So I don't worry about it.
But not militaristic?
No. You want to read a good guy in this? Dmitry Trenin. Trenin. Dmitry Trenin, writes out of Carnegie in Moscow. He'll tell you these guys have absolutely no interest in anything other than making money and making Russia powerful. When you go back and you look at an America, say 1820s to 1830s and 40s, our version was slavery and cotton. Okay, his version is energy. And what we told the world back then was, I don't care what you think, I'm going to make this a powerful country. And Putin's saying the same thing now. Okay? Things will settle out over time because the more people get money, the more they want protection from the government. But now we're at a pretty crude situation where the only way you can protect your money is to be part of the government. But that'll shake out over time. As long as it's market-oriented, as long as it's going downstream and upstream, which they're doing, they're trying to get into the gas market, retail in Europe. There's Lukoil stations up and down the East Coast in America. Not too many Saudi Aramco stations here. So as long as they're willing to go downstream and connect to the global economy, I'm less worried about them.
They're not going to line up with China?
No, they can't stand the Chinese. They never have. They're a pretty racist bunch. You ask the average Russian, they're like, I'm not a racist, except the Chinese. That's how they, it's really stunning. Ma'am.
I just think it's really interesting how you mentioned that the last players of globalization, like China and India, are going to be the ones pushing this towards Africa.
Because I've seen it.
I'm just wondering whether you think the economic power they have is going to be undermined by the softer political voice they have, like their lacking presence in the IMF and the World Bank, for instance. Or
That's being fixed. I mean, they're rejiggering the IMF right now.
right.
And all that stuff has to be fixed. I mean, that's what scares me about a League of Democracies, John McCain. Because he says, I'm different. I'm not like Bush. I'm not unilateralist. And I'm like, buddy, you're still working on the same loser pool that Bush was working on. He was just disrespectful. You're going to be respectful. I'm telling you, that's not a quorum. My quorum has to include Russia, Brazil, India, China, and a whole bunch of others, because they're the players right now. Okay, so we'll be forced to bring them into these corridors of power. What I tell the Chinese, much to your point, I say you're like America about 1890. I have these discussions with PLA planners every time I go, after we have our ritualistic 45-minute discussion on the Taiwan war scenario. And I keep telling them, that is not your problem. And the more you make your military focus on that problem, the bigger the hit you're going to take down the road. Because you reach the same reality that we're reaching about 1880, 1885, 1890. That's where you get Mahan, and everybody else comes on, talks about naval power, Teddy Roosevelt, Great White Fleet, that whole package. They started to realize that in America, our economic connectivity and our network connectivity was up here, but our political military ability to defend it was way down here. So that's what China and India have right now. India's got a military that's good for fighting in Kashmir, which ain't their problem. Okay, and Pakistan obviously has got the same problem too. We give them money like crazy, and they buy a force to take on the Indians in Kashmir. When they got this giant, Badlands territory right next to the capital that they don't even control, and we keep telling them, hey, you gotta work that issue, and they're like, no, pleasure before business. In effect, same with the Indians. They're like, I want to focus on those damn Pakistanis. And the Chinese are, I want to focus on Taiwan. And whenever you talk to them, you say, that's not your problem. Your problem is your energy dependence with the outside world skyrocketing if you're India or China. And when they start killing your people because you're the main purveyors of globalization, it's inevitable. They're going to hold hostages. Indians and Chinese are going to start killing them to drive off globalization because they're the biggest purveyors. And they act like, no, you guys are the purveyors. And you're like, no, we're the enforcers, but you are the people actually doing the connecting. And if your gap between your ability, between say and do, so to speak, is big, if you don't start addressing that, eventually they're going to start targeting you. And you're going to be forced to fund both sides of the war on terrorism, Tom Friedman's phrase about us. Because the Chinese now, for example, they go into Sudan, they got to pay off the central government. Then you know what the rebels do? They start hitting them. They say, why don't you pay us too? And pretty soon the Chinese are going to be paying everybody all throughout Africa.